Recording in progress. 3, 2, 1. Hi everyone, welcome to the Engagement Lab episode 5. This is going to be a really cool one, y'all. We have 3 panelists that we brought in for our 5th session of the Engagement Lab. They were Shima Robinson, Heidi Taylor, and Cole Alvis. And we had a great conversations with them about the actual session and how that went. Before we jump into that conversation, we wanted to just talk a little bit about our process, how we got to bringing in these great 3 panelists to the 5th session, and fill you in on how it's going. As always, I'm joined by my amazing co-host, Jessie Del Fierro.
Howdy, y'all.
Do you want to talk a little bit about why we decided to bring these 3 amazing panelists in?
Thank you so much, my also amazing co-host, Andrés Moreno.
Thank you.
One of the reasons why we decided to bring in 3 panelists across Canada is that part of the conversation we've been having is how are we sharing the work that's already happening? And so previously we've mentioned the desire to listen and hear and witness the work that's been happening in the Alberta theatre community. This has brought us to discuss and imagine and create solo experiments that our participants were able to bring back to their own community, bring back home and engage with. And now we've come to a point where, how is this work being done? What are the different ways we can engage with community that align with the values we bring to our creative work?
Yeah, specifically speaking about the experiments that we set for ourselves, I was really intrigued by the fact that we made it one of our check-in questions. It was just like, how's your experiment going? And the emotions that brought up in some folks when they realized that maybe they had forgotten to do it or that it just hadn't fit into their schedule. I was really intrigued by that because when we first started talking about this, it was the whole idea of embracing failure and then being able to look at that failure and try to troubleshoot into something that would work maybe next time. You know, the idea of the rocket scientist. I just thought it was an interesting moment of like, oh, great. Okay, how can we then set goals for ourselves that if we need to push because of life and we need to let breathe for a moment, we don't feel that guilt. I thought it was a really, really interesting conversation that was had. And then when they jumped in and were able to share with each other, it became very obvious to you and I that not only was it great for them to share what's going on in the community, but we wanted perspectives from all around the country that could maybe inspire some new initiatives or some new changes in our community.
And initiatives that approach this work in 3 very different ways. And in a lot of ways, very different from how we at Theatre Alberta and the 3550 has approached the Engagement Lab. So we're really excited to invite you into this process and chat with some really cool people.
Enjoy. Hi, Shima. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you. Thank you. I'm wondering if you can give folks who are listening just a little introduction to yourself and who you are and where you work and what your work is.
Yeah, so my name is Shima Aisha Robinson, also known as Dweneman. Dweneman means strength, humility, learning, and wisdom in the Adinkra system of symbols from ancient pre-contact West Africa. That's important because it's my pen name and I'm a poet. First and foremost, my main passion is poetry. And then I guess I do lots of jobs aside from the poetry. I work for the Edmonton Poetry Festival as the artistic producer, which is the lead role in that organization. And then I also work for the Fringe Theatre as the learning and outreach manager, which means that I take care of building trainings on the learning platform called Fringe Learn. And I manage outreach during the Fringe Festival, both harm reduction outreach and youth outreach throughout the year. So those are my occupations writ large. I'm also a graduate student, and I incorporate my creative writing methods into my research work. Yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you so much. I love hearing anybody introduce themselves. I just find it super interesting. Thank you so much, Shima. Cole, do you mind introducing yourself?
Tanteo, Nidawashikik Nindijnikas, Nikanok Waju Métis Inda. I am Cole Alvis. and I'm Turtle Mountain Métis. And today I'm in Coast Salish territory here on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory. I'm doing some work with Raven Spirit Dance, which is always exciting. But otherwise, I'm often based in Toronto, where the original and ongoing caretakers include the Mississauga Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat folks. I do a lot of work in Indigenous and queer performance, primarily theater, but sometimes I moonlight in dance and even opera. It's awesome to be here. I get to be supporting a Métis dance artist named Sophie Dow, and they're having a showing tomorrow. So it's great to be by the ocean. Miigwech.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I can't wait to go back to the ocean. And last but not least, Heidi Taylor. Hi, Heidi.
Hi, Andrés. Hi, everyone in podcast land. I'm Heidi Taylor. I'm a white settler here on the unceded and stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And the neighborhood that I'm in is Kimkamalai, which is the Grove of Maples, otherwise known as East Van. I'm a dramaturg and I co-lead Playwrights Theater Center. I do dramaturgy in all kinds of different creative spaces, and sometimes in making programs and sometimes making performances. It's a real delight to be here.
Thank you so much, Heidi. It's a delight to have the three of you here. For our fifth session, we had you all come in and talk a little bit about yourselves, but then the majority of the session became more of a Q&A kind of panel where our participants got to ask you a lot of questions and a lot of very beautiful, poignant questions. I'd love to start here and ask you all, what were your impressions of being in the session, and what was that like for you to come into a process that's nearing an end and see the participants that we have who have been with us from the beginning and see their curiosities?
This is Shima speaking. I think one of the things was that the questions were at a level of thought and consideration that was fairly matured along the process of people trying to ask questions that will serve them best, which is a very good thing. People trying to ask questions that get at the heart of some kind of ambiguity in whenever the topic happened to be and over the course of that gathering. And I appreciated that because it was like these people, they practice that. They know what they're doing. And it also was really generative of some very good conversation. I remember being in the breakout room and not wanting to leave the breakout room, and nobody in the breakout room wanted to leave the breakout room because we're so on one about this thing we were talking about. We're like, oh yeah, this and that and the other. And so I feel like it's a pretty good success of that engagement. I really just want to also add that I'm in Alvis again. I forgot to say the place that I'm in. And I wanted to add that because two reasons. First of all, just because I've been taught that's proper. And second of all, because there were a lot of familiar faces in that gathering that preceded this podcast recording. And a lot of them are from the city I'm in. And it was really nice to see those people ask those types of questions. And it has since been generative of a whole new relational sort of like shift where that conversation is open and living in the community. So I'm really happy about that.
Thank you for bringing that up because you're totally right. Both Cole and Heidi came in to this process a bit more outside of the scope where you really are in the community of it all.
Yeah, I guess what I mean by that is some of the conversations that were sparked in the gathering that we did for the engagement lab have really made it possible to speak frankly and openly about what the aims of certain community members are in the context of their access to space, their access to resources, and how they want to turn perhaps what might be some kind of advantage in that realm toward a community-based deliverable. So whatever that would look like in terms of turning over space to communities to do different things, or turning over resources in some way to create a discourse that will help to fuel that conversation among more people. And it's lovely because it's not always so open. I think we would like to think that our communities are pretty open a lot of the time, but there are these very regular, everyday kind of barriers to having these conversations on all sides. It's not just the folks who might find themselves affluent or might find themselves resourced who have a bit of an overcoming to do. It's also people who definitely don't have those things and want to extend into a communication, a dialogue about deal making and, like these things that are kind of necessary. It's like when it comes down to the brass tacks, it's like, so, time is money and money is time, and we've got to make these things work, and so how are we going to pay for the thing or whatever? And it's nice to have that shift. It's this engagement lab session that we did. People have come up to me and been very open about carrying on the conversations that were sparked in that session. That means that for the both of us, in whatever case, in whatever iteration of conversation, there is a barrier removed. Something tangible and or intangible could just be no contact information, or it could be the perception of there being a problem or a different level of propriety or protocol to approach these types of conversations. But now they've been opened, everything is easier. That's good.
Yeah, as the one panelist who's in the community, I'm really intrigued to see how that continues and how that shifts based on you having come into the space.
Absolutely. Miguel Shima for that territory acknowledgement. And in the spirit of forgetting things in intros, we'll go back to say that I use she, her pronouns. And with a connection I've made with the Two-Spirit artist in my community who has both Michif, the Métis language, and Anishinaabe-Moan, the Chippewa language, Ikwe Wadaza is a verb that has the nature of a woman. And it's a word that has a lot of meaning to me and is something that resonates. So I wanted to share that as part of my intro. And then also jumping off of what y'all are saying, the unique position to be outside community and participating in this gathering, in this workshop. I was born in Southern Alberta, but I think I've been living in Toronto almost half my life now. And so I'm conscious of what it means to be engaging as a bit of an outsider within these conversations. And while I've had the opportunity working with Donna Michelle St. Bernard, the two of us engaged by Theatre Alberta had come in and done some work with some of these members and knowing them through the community. It was particularly exciting to have this be led by both of you, Andrés and Jesse, and to see the local leadership really leading and then having this impact with the rigor of the questions that folks had for us. So really grateful to be parachuting in and out as I sometimes get to do, and just seeing the good work y'all are doing in Treaty 6 and 7 territory.
Thank you so much for that, Nicole. It's always lovely to have you parachute in. And later on, I would like to touch a little bit base on the All-In, because I know that you did a bit of the All-In program, which was, in case you don't remember, the All-In program was kind of our predecessor to the Engagement Lab and to Jesse and I coming on board to working with Theatre Alberta. And so I'm just interested to hear about some of the shifts you've seen from being in the All-In and now coming back, 3 years later, and seeing the community at a much different place than it probably was those years. So yeah, I'd love to touch base on that in a little bit, but I want to make space for Heidi. Hi, Heidi. I'd love if you want to share some thoughts about the session.
Sure. Well, for me, again, coming as an outsider and also coming from a place of multiple privileges, it was a tender place for me to come back into Theatre Alberta. I grew up in Treaty 6 territory and then went back after I finished some theatre training and worked there for about 5 years. And during that time, there was a lot of energy in the community. The Edmonton Professional Arts Council was created. There was a lot of community energy around saving space and creating resources for local artists. But it was not necessarily a very intersectional movement at that time. And so to see the leadership really express the vitality of the community is really exciting. And to then also see the connections that are happening across so many territories, that interweaving of intergenerational leadership is really inspiring to me, but it's also a good reminder to me of where we want to invest power and how to do that. So I really feel, in fact, that the session was probably most of benefit to me, more so than the participants in terms of the work that I shared, although I hope that it was of use to folks. I think that the right balance of who's really doing large-scale national initiatives and who's leading in process on your treaty territories was reflected in the conversation. And so that felt right to me.
Thank you. And I love hearing that the session was also beneficial to you, because, it's beneficial to us every time we hop on. As organizers, I always find that I learn so much just from listening and watching the group go. So I'm glad that you also had that experience, Heidi.
The next question that we're curious about is, as within the session, we had asked if all of you could bring in a project or a process that felt relevant to the work done in the session. And without getting into too much detail about the work, or as much detail as you'd like, did you notice any particular aspects of your work that really resonated with participants? Shima.
Yeah, I had an interesting piece to offer to the engagement, which was track from my most recent, well, my debut album as a spoken word poet. And we were talking about the way that work got done. This was a big topic among the folks who were in the engagement. I was talking about leading a project in a subject position of the only Black person, POC person in the project, but leading it and not having to bear the brunt of a lot of the demands of the project, because it's like I wrote a grant and I did a thing and I put it out there. And I guess I'll talk about that thing a little bit before I move on from that, which is that it's this track called Landing. It's in my book Bellow. Bellow was published. It was a fortuitous timing because I needed to make a book. I was either self-publish or get published, and I got published. So that's available from their website, Glass Bookshop. Yeah, anyway, so as the lead on the project and the only Black person on the project's being funded by a grant that was for diversity and equity in arts from the Edmonton Arts Council. That lent me a lot of interesting lived experience to talk about what it means to be there in that role, doing that work, to do that work with all people who are not BIPOC, to do that work with people who are learning about what it means while they're doing it, and in the context of like the previous 2.5 years, which we all know was lockdown and pandemic and this and that, and kind of getting in where we fit in to try and figure out how to do a 4-month process in 4 days, and then getting this thing off the ground. What resonated, I think, with most people was just like the embrace of that work, more so than just sort of rejecting the rigor of it, but like embracing the rigor of it and taking my time and adjusting things accordingly and preparing myself differently in future, or in the future from the end date of like what I was doing there, for more fruitful, even more general processes of that process is what I'm trying to say. People seem to really be interested in how that works, because I think that that's a realistic situation where we're at in this part of the world. And I'm just in the way that I've seen arts community come together. There is a lot of wonder and supposition and lack of clarity around how it is we achieve justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I'm like, well, for my part, sometimes you just have to pick up the baton and lead everything. And I mean, that's not everybody's answer. That's not everybody's answer, but I kind of love doing it. And it's kind of good news that that's possible. And not begrudged, not challenged, nothing like that. Just people trying to help me to make my vision be brought to life. And that's exciting, because that's, I think, one of the main goals of some of this work is like, just let us be the people who are good at the thing that we're good at, and then we'll do the thing.
But a brilliant example of how everyone in community has a position and an opportunity to support, and to allow us to just be good at what we're good at. Thank you so much.
Miigwech for sharing your work with us, Shima. It was incredible to have art lead at the opening of the session, to actually be engaging with work, while of course we were circling up to speak about work. But awesome for you to share that with us. I was able to speak about a project that Lemon Tree Creations, the queer company that I run with Andrés Kasapi, we're collaborating with the National Arts Center in a project called Stages of Transformation. It's curated by Nikki Shafila and Mploe Mogale, and they describe the project as listening to and learning from abolition movements. Stages of Transformation, a multi-year project of research, rumination, creative exploration, and conversation, bringing together theater artists, arts workers, and creative communities from across so-called Canada. It takes up the imperatives of abolition movements and transformative justice frameworks and investigates their applications to our work in the theater sector. So lots of ideas in there. And one of the things that Lemon Tree gets to do as one of the companies that's collaborating is select an artist who will then make a piece of work about abolition in their practice. And so Lemon Tree chose Raven Wings, an incredible abolitionist artist, dancer primarily, and the various companies chose other artists, and they're all working towards a festival that Rumble Theater's putting on in Vancouver in May. So there'll be a sharing of these pieces at that time. And so what Nikki has done with the NAC, they've got this incredible resource on their website, Stages of Transformation, that's got various conversations, kind of like this one, as well as other resources. And so I was able to introduce that to the group in our session and hope that they're able to engage with the resource in whatever way it's useful to them and potentially come and see the showings this May. So fingers crossed about that.
A question that I'd love to ask for each of you is, how do you keep this work enticing and sustainable for folks? That's something that has been an ongoing question, at least for me and Jesse, as organizers of this lab, is how we keep this work and this kind of community building something that is exciting for folks to show up and enticing, even when we know that the capacity and the resources are getting lower.
It's important to be in relationship in doing this work. When I think of specifically facilitation work around EDI, but even when I'm speaking with my family, many of whom are proud to be right-wing folk, it's lonely and dangerous when I'm by myself. And so I think when I'm co-facilitating, or when I know there's someone in the room with me who has my back, that makes a big difference, particularly when I'll say on the front lines with my family. As much as there's the good work that we do, there's also this resistance and the narrative around sort of writing off lived experiences and knowledges so as to sustain white supremacy. And it's challenging work, as we all know. And so I think what I would say in this instance is to have community, to have support, and to be in reciprocal relationship so that we can be weaving in and out, supporting each other as needed. And so I think that type of community care, particularly when it feels like these challenges are so great, to be able to take specific and even potentially small action now to support those in my community or to receive support from them, even if the long game, maybe I won't be alive for the outcomes of some of this work, still choosing to show up and to try and to push.
Thank you, Cole, for putting into words being in reciprocal relationship. I think that's key to me. I think there are a lot of missteps available for folks who hold multiple privileges, as I do, in thinking about any work that they engage in around justice and equity, that, there's a real white savior complex that we just have to be really rigorous to avoid. And as long as we're staying in that reciprocal relationship, then that's kind of impossible, because it is to everybody's benefit, everybody's, to change the power structures that are currently being upheld in our part of the universe in theater or performance making. So I think in order to make the work enticing and sustainable, I think was the way that you'd put it, Andrés. And I think it's enticing because it's a creative problem. And when we think about our process design for creative projects, we're making the choices about equity, about environmental sustainability, about all valences of justice every time we make a project. And so making choices that uphold or entrench white dominance or economic inequality or gender divisions and phobias, those are choices that we're making. They're just unarticulated choices for people who hold those positions of power or who are on opposite ends of the political spectrum than perhaps the folks who are leading the change might be. And so I think that for me, making that work sustainable is really to just say, well, it is the work. It's not an addition to the work. It's what you're doing every day. And if you're not thinking about that being the way that you're doing it every day, then it makes it possible for people in positions of privilege to think about, quote unquote, stepping back. Well, people who are in the mix of change, who are in the lived experiences of multiple oppressions or positions of being denied equity, have the opportunity to step back. It feels ridiculous for me to say this on this podcast with the four of you in the room, but for listeners who may not have your lived experiences, I think it is important to keep stating that the work is there, whether you make it enticing and sustainable. So you may as well make it enticing and sustainable and do it. And I think, in terms of strategies for that, obviously having a sense of humor helps, because we want to be doing this every day, and the work is serious. It has life impacts on people, and being self-righteous about it gets people nowhere. So having humor, having self-awareness, for me, this is maybe a new one for me, having a clearer identity for myself outside of my theater practice, I think especially for people who are in positions of power within the theater community, is really important. It's hard to think about different power relationships if people's egos are completely wrapped up in their identity within whatever community they are holding power in. So I really hear you, Cole, in the sense that sometimes there isn't safety outside of chosen community. So, just to be alive to the fact that thinking about chosen community and how we feed those chosen communities and are fed by them, that's something about how we sustain practice. And then also for me, taking the work outside of the theater. So, in a practical sense at PTC, looking at what our long-term commitment is to the Migrant Rights Network, or to UNYA, which is the Urban Native Youth Association that's in East Van and is building a center for youth leadership and culture here. So really just, I guess it's a little bit about, and I borrow this phrase from J.D. Derbyshire, right sizing my role within the work in relationship to other people's role within the work, taking up my responsibilities, but not just continuing to privilege myself in terms of my place within there. I'm here to participate. That's my responsibility as a human being. And if I have leadership roles that I've cultivated in whatever ways in the past, I have the responsibility to cultivate that in new ways as I learn new ways.
One of the things that I do and have been doing is to keep the process very mutable, keep things changing, keep things moving in the directions that I'm pulled in, not the directions that I think I ought to go, which is, of course, like, this is a privileged thing to be able to do. It is like I have 2 day jobs, and so I'm good. I can take my creative life wherever I want it to go and not have a catastrophe ensue because there's no issue about bankroll with the creative focus. And one of the things I've recently started to do is freestyle at ciphers, like open mic hip hop ciphers. And just to, like, you know what I mean? Like, that's fun. And that's how I'm currently keeping myself engaged and vitalized and having fun and feeling refreshed about the idea of being a wordsmith at all. Because one of the things that I think we all encounter, we're immersed in some kind of very rigorous process. And there's such a huge outcome that we've hinged a bunch of stuff on, and we have to go and do it. And not that we don't want to, but at the end of it, it's like, like, do we just keep doing this, or is this stressing me out now? Like, is my passion stressing me out now, which is a stressful thing to start to think about. And so keeping it mutable, like I was saying before, is just about, like, for me, it's just about making sure that I find different applications for the part of the craft of poetry, in my case, that excites me, that is challenging, that is easygoing at the same time, that, like, finding new community to sort of just soak in a little bit and figure out what I need to shift in time with things that are shifting anyway. Like, there's the voluntary and the involuntary at play here. And so for me, freestyling at open mic ciphers has changed the way I study my craft and has kept things interesting because I'm not, like, leading that. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not the master blaster of the cipher circle. I am the newcomer who is just like, oh, well, let me try this out. But it also, that shifting of roles, being mindful to not just make that happen, quote unquote, but to actually go where that's real and give yourself a break. Because if you're doing this work and you're, like, leading stuff and you're all over the place with, like, big projects, it's like, go where there's no expectation of you doing that after you've done, or whenever it feels right to do that. Because after you've finished a project that is so rigorous and takes that much leadership and is, like, very important, but also taxing in ways because it's work, go where you can just have fun, make mud pies, play around, like, mess up a lot and have it not matter. You know what I mean? So that's what I do for myself. And then I guess, like, for other people who I work with, what I'm doing now is just, like, letting the pressure out of the pressure cooker and being like, we're going to perform. We're going to, because for my part, the way I was working before was very, like, okay, we have to navigate around a pandemic. We have to get into the studio. We have to make a product. I have to get a book published. That's all very like weighty, very heavy sort of deliverables because they're so tangible. You can't just say we did it. We have to make a proof of. Yeah, and then at this point, like just shifting the modality and being like, now we're gonna have fun with it. Now we've got enough of a structure. We can just play in it. We can just make the moves. And I think that keeping things shifting in your own perspective of like what it is you're doing and why you're doing it, and coming back to the kernel of like what the spark is that started you doing it, I think is, if you can make those explorations, you definitely should.
Thank you all so much.
Something that we have and hold dear to our hearts is this idea that we don't leave anyone behind, which is why I think this work is so interesting, because everyone is in their own different journeys. And so as we continue onwards and moving forward with and bringing people along, what is it that you hope for this work as we continue to see an increase in initiatives or policy work centered around Jedi, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, and representation?
I think increasing the amount of Jedi, this is the acronym we're using, Jedi. I love an acronym. Sorry, I can't live without them. Jedi work in communities. And I guess like that in tandem with like seeing how the fruits of your own labor can be motive towards like a movement toward Jedi as the standard. I think it's also extremely crucial to build in capacity for the very thing we're looking for, which is a sort of an encouragement to rise into leadership, a leaderful instead of leaderless. You know what I mean? A leaderful movement of sorts or culture that allows people to cycle through those positions so you don't always have to be the heavy. You don't always have to be the heavy, right? Even if all the boxes are checked, the ducks are in a row, you got all the skills. Those skills are contingent in my experience on capacity. And your capacity will wane and then fail eventually if you just keep doing full throttle leadership things. And I think that is the important thing that you were calling attention to, which was this idea of having a life outside of that work. Having a life, maybe not outside of, this is the wrong, having something going on for you that you can draw energy, inspiration, motivation, and lessons from, that isn't always contingent on the people you're working with creatively, because that is process. That takes energy and capacity and time and money and all the things that everything always takes in this world we live in. Like for my part, it's like knowing what I can do creatively in a solo context or in a collective context, up to what I've done anyway, because I don't know what I can do in the future, but we'll see. It allows me to balance some of the urgency that I feel in other parts of my life. You know what I mean? And that is a very good reciprocal relationship for those two aspects of life. Like one of them is like full blast and the other one is like, okay, well, there's still this urgency around, which people talk about as a byproduct of white supremacy, which I think can be it can be many things. But a lot of it is legitimate because we know ourselves best and we know when it's time to move on something. And that something could be completely unrelated to our creative work, but we still need to like deal with it. And so I just think it's like having this idea of not rotating, but trading off positions, and trading off that heavy seat and figuring out who's going to do what, when, or leaving it open sometimes and be like, someone's got to do something sometime, but we're in a state of whatever it is, healing or grieving or whatever it is, and letting it be okay in some way, process based or otherwise, because it's not always processed to do this. It can just be it's as simple as me showing up to freestyle night as a novice, to Cypher Circle as a novice, and being like, oh, I'm just gonna do this instead of writing another grant for myself. And then someone else will get that grant. And then I will continue to build my skills in this other way that is much less stressful. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like that's important. And it's an important part of understanding too, that just because we have certain specialties doesn't mean we have to adhere to them all the time. We can just opt into total beginner stage. in any realm and not feel necessarily the pressure to conform to this sort of like model, whatever the thing, model immigrants, model minority, model whatever, and start to really live in that freedom because we're nurturing a life outside of the life that we focus on when we are in creative modes.
I love any reminder to be like, don't write that grant. Take a second. So everything you've done, you were a novice at once upon a time. So like just going back to that is a nice kind of shake up for the body. Thank you for that.
It's also just a beautiful opportunity to be a novice and learn from community and learn from those who do have. And then, yeah, that gorgeous reciprocal idea of when capacity reaches community as being leader full, then it's always flowing and ebbing and being responsive to the needs of who we are at the moment. I had my tarot cards read many years ago, and one of the cards was intermission, which I really love. This idea of we're taking an intermission. It's not that this work no longer exists. It's active in a way that's restful, and we can take a breath, and we're not responsible to anyone other than ourselves. So that was a beautiful reminder of that.
Cool here. I'll jump in on the opportunity for Shima to be at Sec for Night whenever Shima wants to be there. Let's make this happen. And I'm thinking about that in relation to, so Nikki Sheffield with the Stages of Transformation Project has been inviting us to imagine and examine what abolition in the creative process could be. And so some thoughts that I came to and shared with our group in that session was adjusting our goals and outcomes to center community rather than how well we achieved Eurocentric notions of excellence. And one of the other items that I shared was a reduction in the number of works in a season so as to allocate time, energy, spirit to what we pick up, make, and realize. And I feel like that's resonating with what we're saying about the importance of doing the work and showing up and the importance of that intermission that Jesse's speaking of.
It kind of reminds me of something that was brought up in the session, which was there was a question asked that it's like, I'm doing all this work, but it doesn't guarantee that those I love will be able to get to see the work I'm working towards. How do I maintain patience in that? That was kind of, that was me completely just making up the question I was asked. It was asked much more eloquently than that. But it brings me back to that question, like, how do you, in those moments of fear or in those moments of impatience, how do you keep going back to that balance?
Sheila here. Yeah, I think it is a matter of scale sometimes. Like when we think about like scale, a scale of expectations, like I would love to see, I don't know, a spoken word poetry program in every high school that's thriving, that contributes to, whatever. I'd love to see this huge thing. But I'm probably not going to see it until I'm much older, or if at all, because of all the barriers and hurdles and this and that you have to do to get to the thing. But I think further to like the amalgamation of the two answers, I think is that like you have to build in personal gratification. You have to be like, it's not always about realizing the master cause, the huge coup, the thing, like it's like you have to be able to say to yourself and believe, and this is hard. It's not easy usually, but you can get there in my humble opinion, which is like you have to ask yourself, what is the thing that lends me courage, and what is the thing that calms my anxiety, and what is that thing? You have to explore to find it. But once you've found it, and if it's creative or what, it doesn't matter what it is, but once you've found it, pursuing it is literally the responsibility of the pursuant. Like you have to just do it, because that, in my experience, has allowed me to think about a 20-year development plan for myself for something else I'm doing. It has allowed me to think about it. When we start to say things like that out loud, people are just like, oh, like, no, I don't want to think about 20 years. Like, what do we even know about 20 years? But I mean, I think it is worth thinking about. It is worth considering how what is the future we want? Like, what is our, like that, I think is a big theme in Jedi anything. It's like, what is the future we want? And like, how do we make sure that whether or not we get to see it, we're here for long enough to to feel like we've seen something. Because we think about 50 years down the line all the time. We have dreams of how the tectonics of our various social and professional lives will shift so that we don't have to constantly be, like holding a fault line together or something. But I mean, it's still hard to think about that when we start to think about work, when we start to think about process, when we start to think about our own intentions and not just where it's going to end up in a sort of a dream world kind of thing. Yeah, just to reiterate, like, not just self-care, but self-care becomes community care, becomes self-care. It's an oscillation. That's the way it has gone for me every time. And it's connecting with people. It's finding your wellness in your own space and body and place. If you can find that, if you have access to that, and that level of solitude for me is also really, really key. And like, it's just you find the way to inspire yourself in these very quiet, perhaps humble, perhaps just self-preservatory ways. And I think that works. Like that's like the fail safe. Like they can't take that from us. Whoever they are or whatever. Anyway.
Cool here. I appreciate this question, Andrés, because I think that there is a tension here when it comes to the trap of scarcity. And Manadude Collective is the company that I run with Yolanda Bennell, an Ojibwe South Asian artist. And we have these indigenizing practices that we're working through, which includes shorter work days, which can mean longer, more weeks of engagement. And so that puts a pressure on us as producers to find those funds to afford to do that. And when we are successful in doing so, it allows us to work less and work smart, and then have our bodies and our spirits rest while we're doing the work. White Girls in Moccasins is the show we just did in co-production with Buddies and Bad Times Theater. And we were aligned with them in the planning of the production schedule in advance so that we were able to achieve this. Tech rehearsals can often have 10 of 12-hour days, and we maxed out at 8 was our longest day. And we were successful in getting the show up. And so the production manager, Rebecca Vandeveld, was reminding us that while we have more weeks together, the number of hours in the space was actually the same as a shorter engagement. And so, of course, every minute is important. But I guess I'm coming back to, I'm pushing back on the pressure to say yes to all things and to burn myself out. I think that that's something that I have done and I will probably do again. But how can we imagine working in ways, finding those resources, creating a working structure that discourages that behavior and provides? Is that possible?
This is Heidi here, just to say a big yes to what Cole's just proposed, and I guess to keep looking at where these ideas are being tested and to learn from the case studies that are out there. I think Means of Production, the collective of production managers and TDs, and I think mostly based out of Toronto, but trying to find more of a national perspective, they're really testing budgeting. And so there's something about, I guess my hope is that we keep attentive to the moments of decision that determine what is available to our collaborators and ourselves later in the process, which is exactly what Cole was just talking about. And that we, especially for folks who are in current positions of power, that we keep bringing those questions to people who do have the power to change what the basic assumptions are. So I think that's just a basic task for people who, like myself, are in institutional positions, to just keep asking and to keep bringing those questions to where we might not feel super comfortable or as privileged, in terms of relationship with colonial government and colonially structured granting organizations. But then my other thought around my hope for this work is that there's a principle that I think I learned from Denise Clark at One Yellow Rabbit, but it is a yogic principle of cultivate the opposite. And so I think, especially because my hope is that this podcast will be listened to by a real variety of folks coming from a variety of positionalities within the theater community. is to just bring that attentiveness to when it's time to slow down, when it's time to speed up, when it's time to seed or share or generate new sources of power, and when it's time to tear stuff down, right? So there's something around that question of cultivating the opposite, to also know when are we attached to things that serve a really broad range of folks, and when are we attached to things that really only serve ourselves, and can we find generosity to detach, and to, again, in cultivating the opposite, to say, okay, well, where are the spaces that I don't actually need to be? Where are the power positions that I don't need to be? And to try to cultivate curiosity about, well, what if we do it differently? What if this is it? What if there are ways that we don't know how to do things yet? And to try and find some grace in that not knowing, while still being accountable for the things that we do know, and the things that we can share, and the things that we can take accountability, I guess would be the term that I find useful for change. That's the end of this current thought.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on this kind of notion that failure is part of the work, and kind of just hear what that brings up for each of you.
Shima here. Failure being part of the work is so actually comforting for me, because I'm like, oh, well, failure is part of life. Like, we're not always, no matter how best laid plans, whatever, you can't get away from the tension of it. But it's what makes it so awesome when we succeed at something, when we get the thing done in whatever increment. But failure as being part of it allows for a less linear trajectory to be thought of and to be conceptualized in my own brain, when I think about, like, what do I do about my own creative practice, about advancing Jedi principles, about, doing those things in tandem, about maybe not doing those things at all because of whatever the state of my being is. I might be sick. I might be, like, going through a rough go, or, like I was saying, grieving. Grief is the big one lately. I think failing almost like spectacularly can be one of the more cathartic experiences of life. Like, if you're like, wow, I learned a million lessons in 5 days and none of the things I was working on exist anymore. Like, that's like very like, oh no. But I think it's truly just like as simple as that. Like, failure is a part of life. Failure is part of the process. Failure is not to be taken super lightly, though, I don't think. Like, I'm laughing. I'm kind of laughing to assuage the tension. Because I'm like, oh, failing. But I think it's like there are lessons in the evaporation of a thing too. There's a lesson in crash landing, and it makes me think about, again, scale, right? If we can conceptualize the scale of any engagement, involvement, plan, process as being a small bit, an iteration of a larger goal, then failure becomes manageable in my brain. It becomes like, if this doesn't work, I can fall back. There's enough balance in my life, and I won't completely tank, and I will come back to some landing place that will be a jump off for the next thing that I do. And like, having a long view sometimes means thinking about that within a 6-year span or something. Like, if this doesn't work, I will have to go back to this square. This is square 2, or this is square 1, or whatever. But like, yeah, I think it is only life. Like, life is just this very potentially reductionist statement, but it is super just lived. This is a lived experience, and we're not guaranteed to constantly succeed and win. And so, I mean, it's just about surrounding, like, for me, it's about surrounding myself with like people and places and things and relationships that are generative of something that I can come back to. Like, where is square one? It's more important for me to know where square one is than to know what the final project or product looks like, because square one can't move as much. It's got to be reliable. Yeah. And I will acknowledge that, again, it comes from a very privileged sort of place, because it's like not everybody has square one set up for them. Doesn't mean they can't get it set up, and it doesn't mean that it's not a possibility.
This question of failure makes me think of perfection or the pursuit of perfectionism. And last week, I got to be asked to participate in a co-facilitation process with Pauline Shirt, who's a Plains Cree knowledge keeper. And I often get to engage Pauline dramaturgically on the creative work that I make. And that's sort of primarily the way in which we engage with each other, as well as, I guess, potentially socially. But a friend of mine asked me to co-facilitate with her a teaching on the making of medicine bags. And as soon as ceremonies involved, I flip into this Christian colonially inspired notion of perfectionism that I got to get it right. And I put all this pressure. And so Pauline gave me the list of things to source and earcrafts on Nations. I knew would have everything for me. And I decided to bring my dog. And so I'm worried about, is she happy and safe? Getting all the materials. We've got our hide, we've got our medicine. She'd suggest grabbing these beads. And she also referenced that some ermine tails would be great if I could grab whatever they have of those. And so that was going to be my gift for her. And it was. But in all of my organizing and pursuit of perfection on this day of gathering materials, the beads that she'd recommended be part of the bags that we're going to then ask folks in the workshop to make ended up at the bottom of the bag with the ermine tails. And so I dropped those off on her front porch and off I go. And as I'm looking at all the materials the night before heading to this event, I can't find the beads. And this pressure that I placed on myself to be perfect about the list that was very clear, my capacity to get certain materials, we didn't end up having the beads. They were with Pauline. And I think the teaching here around failure and perfection is that the beads were always meant to be a gift for her. But I had spun this into some kind of lacking or failure of myself or all of the things that kept me up that night. And so just wanting to name something that my therapist talked about, this two-spirit person from Anishinaabe Health who's incredible, the tendrils of colonialism. When are those things showing up in my life? And I feel like this story is one of those.
Thanks, Cole. This is Heidi. That is such a beautiful representation of how we define failure and how often the self-definition of failure really has almost no relationship to the community definition of failure. And so what I would maybe add to this question of, what is the relationship to failure is that I really run hot and cold on it, like from a creative perspective, in terms of saying, this is the first impulse towards this project or towards this moment in a project. And this is what actually happened. And that sometimes a large gap between those two things, we call a failure, where we didn't have the capacity that we assessed that we had. And so the thing didn't work the way that we wanted it to, or the way that we thought we could have done it. And that kind of failure, I think, we can think about changing our mindsets in order to reduce the stress of that, or reduce the, as you've termed them, the tendrils of colonialism that help to create that gap. But I think that is also part of the human experience of having desires, right? And having desires that are delicious and huge, and that then reality and desire doesn't always align. And that misalignment can cause frustration and can cause disappointment and can cause also revelation. So I think that's where the productivity of good failure comes in. And then for me, there's also something that is failure that should be, I don't know, avoided is maybe hubris, because we all are going to continuously fail as human beings. But I do think there's something about harm, and that we do have responsibilities around reducing our participation and our purposeful creation of contexts that create harm. And failure in those contexts, I think, have consequences outside of the creative satisfactions or the success of a collaboration, or even the impact on a community of a particular piece of work. Well, nobody saw it. Okay, well, that's a failure, but it might sting, but it's not necessarily causing somebody harm. It's a different thing when the failure is actually impacting people's well-being in a way that we do have capacity to change. There are sometimes when people are harmfully impacted and we don't have the capacity to change that. We're in a system that we're working against, and we just haven't found the right way. We haven't accessed the right kind of power to try and transform that in the tiny context that we're working in. Like that's real. But there are also times when failure comes from laziness, or it comes from ego, or it comes from just not paying attention to something that is actually really clear that people have expressed that you're just willfully ignoring because, maybe for really legitimate reasons, but that, we do need to think about when failures are causing harm. And if we see ourselves going towards that, is the failure to just stop? Or is that the success? We see ourselves going towards harm, towards, oh, well, maybe this is going to be successful in some of the terms that we've set for ourselves, but it's actually going to be a failure in terms of the values that we've claimed we're in alignment with. Then to me, the failure is to not stop. The failure is to pursue the, Eurocentric or white dominant ideas of excellence and achieve those and leave, wreckage in people's lives along the way. And so I think that there's something about being alive to what failure means for each individual in terms of our cultural makeup, and being alive to what we can release ourselves from and what we might need to hold ourselves to with care and with gentleness, but with real rigor in order to avoid those kinds of failures that are actually real consequences. Like what are there's failure and then there's consequences. And I think sometimes we need to articulate what the real consequences of a failure are and how we're being accountable to those consequences.
What a beautiful way to articulate the complexity around failure and how quick we are to personally, failure for me is I'm very quick to either dismiss or to catastrophize. And so the complexity of living within that. And also, the space, as my therapist describes it, like the dance room we have to be in conversation with ourselves and with others around failure, and consequentially around consequence and impact. Thank you.
Could I just add one little note? I just feel really like in terms of representing where these thoughts are coming from, they are very much an articulation of what the PTC team has been working on for the past year. And these are things that they have really taught me. So I just want to acknowledge the knowledge of the leadership team at PTC, because these are things that they're holding me accountable to and that we are really working through in relationship to some challenging work that we're doing institutionally. So this is Heidi reporting from PTC. These are not my original thoughts.
That's so lovely. Thank you. Thank you for that, because that's such a beautiful example of shared knowledge.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you as well to all of you, because you've been really great at throwing out resources and people who have helped you in your life and kind of modeling what you've been talking about throughout the whole conversation, which is to keep the relationships alive and keep the communication and the connections with each other alive. Now, as we close off, pals, I would love to give you each some time to maybe plug anything that you're working on, or let us know if folks want to reach out to you.
Grateful to be part of this circle and present with you all. I could plug my first full-length play that I'm writing. Just had a reading at the Native Earth Performing Arts New Works Festival, and there isn't currently snow on the ground. I'm not allowed to tell you the name of the festival, but as per Cree cosmology, my play is called And Then They Came, and it is inspired by the founding of the Métis Nation. So look for me at manadunes.com, lemontreecreations.ca, and I'll be writing this play in the meantime. Miigwech.
Right now, I'm working on building my chops to start writing a rap album, because why not? Why wouldn't I do that? That sounds like a fun thing. My existing published work can be accessed by contacting me through my website, which is denseverse.net. And then also, and all the contact information's on there, all the stuff. There's samples of my work, etc. So if you've never heard of me, go check it out. It's fun. And then Last Bookshop's website has the book Bellow, which was recently published. And then what else? Find my work. You can buy my first book from me directly if you're an Amiskwachi Waskagan, aka Edmonton, and you want to read my first book. It's not available online anymore because an online store costs more than it yields. So that's not cool. But I will bring it to you. I will deliver it to your hot hands if you so desire. So that's a vibe.
I think I would point folks towards the company website, playwrightstheatre.com. We have a bunch of amazing digital projects that are there for whenever you hear this podcast. I'd point you towards our unscripted page where there's some beautiful documentation of a process with mermaids.
The Engagement Lab podcast is possible with the initial support from 3 local foundations to transition our all-in program to the 3550 initiative and the Engagement Lab. The foundations were the Edmonton Community Foundation, Calgary Foundation, and the Rozsa Foundation.
We're thrilled to announce that the Engagement Lab is supported by both Alberta Culture's Community Initiatives Program and the Canada Council for the Arts. Feed Alberta is grateful to our operating funders, the Alberta Foundation for the Arts, the Edmonton Arts Council, and Calgary Arts Development. Thank you so much for tuning in.
And we'll see you next time at the Engagement Lab podcast.